сказати. Добре, я очолюю відділення, яке організує українські проєкти в Атлантичній Раді Америки. Ми розпочали з моїм колегою, колишнім послом Джон Гербст і колишнім членом Ради національної безпеки Америки Деймон Вілсон, двома більш-менш Україні відомими експертами. Обширний проєкт в співпраці з державними установами України в декількох галузях. So let me just, I forgot, I'm supposed to switch into English. So I'm with the Atlantic Council and with former Ambassador John Herbst and former National Security Council staffer Damon Wilson. We have launched a fairly wide-ranging program of cooperation with the Ukrainian government, which will bring together experts from Europe, the United States, and the Ukrainian government on what we would call sort of rapid response teams dealing in 5 thematic areas related in part to the theme that I want to talk about, which is the sense of Russian vulnerabilities and Russian the points of potential pressure that the international community and Ukraine can bring to the table as a pushback both from the current aggression and further aggression. So very briefly, the basic facts are well known to you. The Russian exchanges are down 10% over the last month, in the last year, both because of emerging market turbulence and because of the Russian military action. The value of the ruble has declined 20% in the last 52 weeks. Russia has entered a recession, which was expected to last 2 years. Prior to the invasion, the calculations were that Russia would be growing at no more than 1%. These calculations in 2014 and 2015, now this is projected to be negative growth. We know the immediate sanctions that the EU and certainly the United States will be taking with regard to Russian passports of people who have Crimean points of origin. We know the level 1 and level 2 sanctions that have been announced. We also know there's a roster of potential costs to Russia in subsidizing the very weak, and now because of the invasion, the increasingly weak Crimean economy. And I'll talk about all of these things in this kind of an overview and briefing. There are a number of mechanisms that can be extremely harmful to Russian interests. One of them that is beginning to be discussed with increasing frequency belongs to the Ukrainian government's, I would say, basket of tools to use. And I know for a fact that in various key Ukrainian ministries, discussions of these mechanisms are being, at the very least, evaluated and considered. The first is what is called odious debt, or potentially war debt, to declare a condition of war under international practice in various different kinds of conditions. Debt that was generated through corrupt practices of government officials, if it was known to the debtor, can be subject to denunciation and to non-payment. It can simply be abrogated. Ukraine currently and Ukrainian companies have between $30 and $40 billion in debt, not only to the Russian state, which is state debt, bilateral debt, partly as a result of the Yanukovych-Putin agreement, but there are further corporate debts. These potentially can be blocked, suspended, payments on them, or abrogated in return in compensation for the seizure of property. I work also, in addition with the Atlantic Council, I work with a range of investment groups who hold bonds. I speak regularly with this community. In fact, I've been in their company in the last few days here in Kiev, and I can say that the international financial community would not consider Ukraine's abrogation of debts to Russia under these conditions to be a default condition. It would not affect the good standing of Ukrainian fundraising on capital markets, on bond markets going forward. And especially in the context now of this set of IMF agreements and the ongoing $27 to $29 billion of additional refinancing and direct aid that is coming from the international community, Ukraine could, if it so chose, could take these kinds of, I would say, more radical steps without deleterious consequences in terms of its relationship to international markets. One of the other issues that I think the Ukrainian government should be examining, and I know that the beginnings of this are the inventorization of seized properties. That is, the material value of not just the military equipment that has been seized and captured by Russian forces. There is a cash value to the land in Crimea, which is 2.7 million hectares. If you assume a sort of a round price of, say, $1,000 per hectare, that yields a $2.7 billion claim that could be made against the Russian government. There are further claims for the value of the assets of Chernomornaftogaz. There are claims against the potential future gas holdings and oil holdings that might be on the territorial shelf of Crimea. In other words, there is a huge array of potentially disruptive measures and claims that Ukraine can make in international courts, potentially in national jurisdictions, to recapture some of these takings from the Russian government. To return a little bit to odious debt, international lawyers consider this form of debt to be when there is a known condition of potential corrupt action, and yet there is continued relationship in the full knowledge of that corruption. So Ukraine would have to go through courts to make this kind of a claim. But I think a strong claim could be made that given the very strong presence of the Russian intelligence services, the strong knowledge that the Russians had of real estate purchases made by Mr. Yanukovych and his family in Russian territory, that it was entering into relationships in a condition in which there are questionable practices that would fall under this claim that it was dealing with a leadership that was tainted, and therefore that the bonds could be considered by the new government as having been part of a broader system of corruption. In any event, these are issues that can be discussed. Finally, there is not what is in the Ukraine's quiver, there is what is in the Western quiver. We have spoken, many people have commented, the range and the level of actions that have been taken by the West, sort of what are called level 1 and level 2 sanctions. They are not very impressive. But what is being held behind is not even a joint action by the EU and by the United States. It can be a unilateral action by the United States in what would be called level 3 sanctions. The United States, in effect, can unilaterally shut down Russian banking system access to international markets by making correspondent relationships with Russian banks impossible due to its heavy interrelationship with the international banking system. The United States did not always find Europe congruent with its more harsh sanctions regime against Iran, but it was able to impose through this additional effect costs on Iran before broader international sanctions had been adopted. So no interbank borrowing, freezes on the assets of companies that have been, which have passed through Russian banks. In short, just many people in the financial community understand, and I am not a member of that community, but I work with them and I advise them on sort of political risk and the like. But in the conversations that our team at the Atlantic Council have had and that I have had, it is clear that there are very strong, robust mechanisms that could, in effect, shut Russia off from credit markets and so on. So then what we're talking about is a Russian economy, and I'm not advocating that level 3 sanctions be introduced at this moment. I'm simply laying out that there is a sort of a, major event that can take place with regard to the Russian banking system if further aggressive actions are taken, or even if additional aggressive actions are not taken, but simply in the judgment of the United States could trigger this third level of harsher and much more wide-ranging sanctions. So I think I will perhaps conclude on that this is the array of issues, this is the array of factors. The general, and also I'd say the general view in the financial communities is that if Russia were to take further territorial actions against Ukrainian soil, that it would have a hugely dramatic effect on the value of Russian shares and on the value of Russian currency, well beyond this current level of decline. Russian business leaders who are quietly in contact with their Western banking and financial counterparts freely admit that this is a problem. Russian bankers have had these conversations, and Russian financial leaders have clearly had these conversations with Mr. Putin subsequent to the Crimean episode. It's also been reported by people who are in contact with these leading Russian financial representatives and sometimes lobbyists, that at one of these meetings, Mr. Putin was to have said that what do you care about more, your country or your profits? So it was very clear that Mr. Putin is willing to consider actions that can have a deleterious effect on the Russian market. But the question is, how deep is his tolerance and how deep is the tolerance of the overall Russian elite to further such actions? So I thought that it was worthwhile to raise this dimension of the relationship, to emphasize that Ukraine has measures that it can take. No one is advocating that Ukraine take measures without due consideration, due consultation, and probably in harmonization with the rest of the international community. It's clear that on the transportation networks, on the oil and gas flows, that both those countries are heavily interrelated. 80% of Ukraine's rail traffic and freight traffic and the east-west traffic from Russia goes through the Ukrainian railway system. It is clear that Russia cannot afford as well to have those kinds of contacts disrupted. The point that I'm making is not to underscore that there should be an economic war against Russia. It is to underscore that Russia has to take into consideration the potentially deeply disruptive effects of a cascading series of very deep measures that are not discussed broadly as yet, but are discussed privately, broadly within governments and within the financial community, more or less at a sort of an early investigative moment. So I'll conclude with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this or other topics, should there be any interest from you all.
Yeah, we have questions, actually.
Спасибо. Михаил Штекель, Пресс-ТВ. Судя по последнему заявлению Януковича, Россия выбрала тактику не военного присоединения тех или иных областей, а проведения референдумов с тем, чтобы создать волеизъявление народа и после этого их присоединить. В случае подобной ползущей мирной агрессии, готовы ли США или ЕС вводить санкции третьего уровня? Спасибо.
Well, it's an interesting question. I can't quite give you a concrete answer. I don't think it would trigger level 3 sanctions, and in fact my interpretation is that it is a sign that Russia is looking to back away from the military scenario. That is to say that executing a referendum without the will of the sovereign country is an impossible fact. The fact that Yanukovych drifted and sort of spoke about nationwide referenda is also a bit of a problem for Russia, because with Crimea now outside, we all understand that the clear political balance in Ukraine's politics has shifted, and it would be much harder for pro-Russian candidates' sentiments, or even mildly pro-Russian sentiments, to have majority support. So it just seems to me that this was a sign. The press conference was a sign of two things. One, of another signal that the Russians are moving back from the precipice, from this aggressive military posture, and two, that Mr. Yanukovych has basically run out of things to speak about. You will not be able to do on a regional basis without the support of the Central Election Commission and without a group of gangsters, as happened, armed with Soviet troops moving into a territory and ordering a referendum. That will be sort of technically impossible. The level of public support and protests has been in decline, so the card that Russia was playing of these mounting protests, the ones that were sort of under the rubric of the Russian Spring, have also failed. So it just seems to me that this is a kind of I would say, an orderly retreat from the original expectations and more of an adjustment to the reality that is occurring within public opinion. I believe it's a standout, to answer your question, not a sign that should trigger new aggressive sanctions.
Hi, Peter Kenyon from NPR. These scenarios, these rather radical measures you talked about, the bad debt, one reason that you're not advocating it right now, or these level 3 sanctions, is because that could trigger some retaliation from Russia. You talked about rail traffic, you talked about economic ties. I mean, it cuts both ways, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and look, there is a reality here. There is a kind of an anomalous, there was an act of war, in effect, that was committed by Russia. It was committed mercifully without a heavy amount of bloodshed. There was no direct, with the exception of one victim, one soldier, there was not a massive conflict. So there is, and the Ukrainian economy has an unbalanced and disproportionately large relationship with Russia. It will devolve over time, and clearly the opening on the western side of reduced tariffs and so on will speed up that process of Ukraine finding new markets. The inflow of cash and capital will as well. It's less the provocative nature, but I think that this big war would also have a drag effect on European economies. It's clear everybody is interrelated. The U.S. would be more resistant to this because U.S. trade with Russia is pretty minimal. Relative, clearly, to Europe and even relative to Ukraine, proportionally. So my caution is, because we're dealing with this, this anomaly of a country that is deeply angry and offended by this aggressive action of the Russians, who has behaved with remarkable restraint and with pragmatic approach, and the public, as you look at presidential preferences, is also not in a radical mood. So I think that we have the conditions of having a set of retaliatory actions, but there is not, I think, a clamor for them that would press local politicians. I think the point, though, is that the media, the Russian leadership, the Ukrainian public, and the international community should know that there are these mechanisms. They're very deep. They can have real deep consequences for the Russian economy. So I'm not sure that I'm thinking that the Russians are about to invade, and that's not the reason why we're reticent. I think we need to have a dialogue, because these ideas have only begun to be socialized through the media in the last 10 days or so. I think, and the Peterson Institute issued a paper. There are some very interesting documents and papers that have been written by international lawyers. Oyustet was invoked in the case of Iraq, but Ukraine has a great reputation in its academic life of a strong school of international law, and there are very strong international lawyers here, and I'm sure they are, and I know that they are beginning the process of looking at this at a variety of ministries and on an interministerial level.
Якщо в нас питань немає, то я ще є одне питання. Будь ласка.
Я просто хотел бы подчеркнуть, может быть, вы меня не так поняли. Янукович призвал не к национальному референдуму, а к серии местных референдумов, направленных, как мы понимаем, на раскол областей. А проведение местных референдумов, вы же понимаете...
Ну, просто практически невозможно такие референдумы организовать без сотрудничества местных властей. Чтобы местные власти были готовы на это, это тоже очень сложно было бы сделать, если бы центральное государство не удобрило такое решение. И просто
этот процесс уже идет.
Нет, но он такой, это маргинальный процесс, особенно если контролируют эти волны очень активной молодежи, тетушек из России, тетушек от Белгорода и от Москвы, которые пересекали границу. Сейчас, по-моему, это контролируется, нет таких больших волн, нет таких больших столкновений, и, по-моему, нет механизма, там просто нет народа, который мог бы это как-то организовать, принудить местные власти это сделать. Просто это моя оценка, может быть, это сменится, но сейчас это малореально.
Дякую, Адріана, дякую, що ви прийшли до нас.
Дякую.